The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like a swarm of insects trapped in glass. Margaret Walsh arrived at Diego's diner at 5:11 a.m., pushing through the kitchen entrance with the kind of efficiency that came from muscle memory, the same muscle memory that once moved through field hospitals in Tikrit under mortar fire. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. The kind of steady that came from having sutured arteries while shells impacted concrete 17 meters away. Nobody at Diego's knew that. Nobody here knew anything about her except that she showed up early, poured coffee without spilling a drop, and never complained about the worst shifts. She hung her jacket on the hook behind the swinging kitchen door, the faded 75th Ranger Regiment patch sewn into the lining pressing briefly against her ribs before she let the fabric fall away. The patch had been cut from her son's first combat jacket, the one he wore to Kandahar when he was 23 years old. She'd stitched it into her diner uniform 6 years ago, after the letter came. After she understood that some threads between a mother and a child could never be severed, only hidden. The kitchen smelled like yesterday's grease and today's coffee grounds. Margaret moved to the prep station and began rolling silverware into napkins with the precision of someone folding bandages. 12 tablecloths needed checking. 16 coffee thermoses needed filling. She could do both before the first customer arrived at 6:22 a.m. The diner had been her anchor for 3 years. After Tikrit. After everything else was supposed to be over but wasn't. After the army had formally informed her that Major Margaret Walsh no longer existed in any official capacity, that her service record had been classified beyond classification, that she was to maintain absolute silence about the hostage extraction that had gone sideways in 2009. The diner asked nothing of her except punctuality and the ability to remember that Mrs. Chen took her eggs over easy and Mr. Kowalski wanted his toast cut diagonal, not straight. These things she could do. These things did not require her to be anyone she used to be. Frank Brennan arrived at 5:58 a.m., same as always, carrying a leather portfolio and the kind of cologne that smelled like someone who believed money could erase everything. He owned Diego's, or so he'd told everyone when he bought it 8 months ago. Margaret had served him coffee twice since then, both times noting the way his eyes moved across the register when he thought nobody was watching. The way his fingers lingered on the cash drawer. The way he smiled at customers in the dining room but never in the kitchen, where the staff could see his actual face. At 6:14 a.m., Margaret moved to restock the coffee station near the back hallway, and she noticed Frank's office door standing partially open. Protocol said she should have kept walking. Protocol said she should have pretended she saw nothing. Protocol said a lot of things that didn't account for 17 years of combat medicine, where seeing things you weren't supposed to see and saying nothing was the difference between staying alive and becoming part of the problem. She slowed. Just slightly. Just enough to glance. Frank stood beside his desk, his back to the open door, one hand reaching toward the register he kept in his office, a second register, the real one, separate from the one the customers used. The one that supposedly never existed. She watched his fingers extract bills. $340, she counted, though she made no gesture that showed she was counting. She watched him move to the filing cabinet and open the receipt book, the one that supposedly recorded every transaction made at Diego's. She watched him alter a figure. Cross something out. Write something new. Write something smaller. His shoulders tensed. It happened so gradually that someone who wasn't trained to notice micro-expressions might have missed it. The slight elevation of his trapezius. The barely perceptible turn of his neck. The moment when recognition hit him like a physical impact, he had felt her watching him, the way humans feel a predator's gaze even without turning around. Frank spun. Their eyes met across the threshold. Margaret stood perfectly still, coffee pot in her hand, face arranged in the expression of someone who had simply been passing by. The fluorescent lights buzzed between them like a warning. Frank's jaw tightened. His eyes moved from hers to the register in his hand, then back again, calculating. Measuring. Deciding what the fact of her presence in this doorway at this exact moment meant for his immediate future. You need something. His voice came out steady, but Margaret heard the subharmonic underneath it, the frequency of a man whose calculation had shifted. He had seen her see him. More importantly, she had not looked away. Just restocking. Margaret's voice was exactly what it needed to be. Quiet. Deferential. Apologetic without actually apologizing. The voice of someone who was simply a nurse, simply a waitress, simply a woman who existed in other people's peripheral vision. I can come back. No. Frank turned back to his desk, casually sliding the register into a drawer. I'm done here anyway. Margaret moved down the hallway toward the coffee station, her shoulders relaxed, her gait unchanged. She did not accelerate. She did not rush. She did not give him the satisfaction of showing that anything had altered in her internal landscape. But her mind had already begun the process, the same process that had kept her alive in Tikrit, the same process that had helped her disappear into civilian life for 3 years. Threat assessment. Vulnerability catalog. Escalation probability matrix. Frank knew that she knew. And Frank was the kind of man who would not tolerate being known. She filled coffee thermos number 4. Number 5. Number 6. Her hands did not shake. The coffee did not slosh. By 6:22 a.m., the first customer had arrived, Mr. Orozco, who always ordered black coffee and wheat toast and who always asked how her son was doing, a question that required her to smile and say good and mean it in the way that mothers mean such things, with the kind of composure that could outlast artillery fire. At 6:31 a.m., an elderly man Margaret had never seen before entered Diego's and took a seat in booth 7. He was thin. His breathing came with a slight wheeze, and his hand shook when he reached for the menu. Military bearing, Margaret noted automatically, the same way she noted blood pressure and respiratory rate. The way he sat today. The way his eyes moved across the room in a pattern that suggested he had been trained to identify threats and exits. The way his weathered face carried the specific gravity of someone who had been responsible for other people's lives and was never quite relieved of that responsibility, even in a small diner on a Wednesday morning in San Diego. Margaret poured his coffee without being asked. He was old enough and carried himself in a way that suggested he preferred things done efficiently. "Thank you," he said, and his voice was the kind that had probably given orders to a lot of people a very long time ago. "Just water for now. I'll order in a minute." She nodded and moved on, the coffee pot balanced in her hand like a gun holstered at her side. Across the diner, through the service window into the kitchen, she could see Frank staring at her. Not looking away. Not pretending he wasn't looking. Just staring with the expression of a man whose calculation was still ongoing, whose threat assessment had elevated her from invisible to significant. The fluorescent lights continued their electric hum. The kitchen clock ticked towards 6:38 a.m., and outside the diner windows, San Diego was beginning to wake up, the kind of ordinary morning that happened to billions of people every single day, the kind of ordinary that Margaret had spent 3 years trying to become, before the man sitting in booth 7 and the man staring at her from across the kitchen had both decided, without knowing it yet, that her time living invisible was running out. The shift change came at 2 o'clock on a Tuesday, and Frank Brennan delivered the news like a man handing down a sentence. Margaret was wiping down the breakfast counter when he appeared beside her, his cologne sharp as a blade cutting through the smell of hash browns and burnt coffee. "You're moving to closing," he said. Not asked. Stated it the way someone announces a prison transfer. Margaret set down her rag. 3 years of breakfast shifts. 3 years of 5 a.m. clock INS and regulars who knew her order pad before she reached their tables. 3 years of invisibility that had kept her exactly where she wanted to be. Effective immediately, Frank continued, already walking away. Schedules posted. She found it on the employee board next to the kitchen pass, her name moved to the graveyard column in Frank's blocky handwriting. The other waitresses, 3 of them rotating the evening shift, were standing in a cluster when she clocked in that Thursday. They saw her coming. They all saw her coming. What they did when she arrived at her assigned section was worse than any insult. They left. Not rudely, not with drama. Just stood, gathered their things, and drifted toward the host stand like Margaret had become a section of floor that needed avoiding. When she approached, offering to help with a table, the youngest one, Stacy, 22, always friendly during morning breaks, glanced at the others and said, "We're good, actually." The politeness made it worse. It was the tone you'd use with someone quarantined. Margaret felt the pull of old instincts. The urge to sit alone, be grateful for the solitude, use the silence as a shield. Instead, she worked her section with the same precision she'd used in Tikrit, efficient, methodical, present for people who needed her, and tried not to notice how every staff member seemed to find reasons to work the opposite end of the restaurant. The schedule on the employee board took on new shape that Saturday morning. Frank had posted it where customers could see it, surrounded by specials and happy hour announcements. Margaret's name appeared alone on every major holiday for the next 6 months. July 4th, closing shift, solo. Thanksgiving, closing shift, solo. Christmas Eve, closing shift, solo. Every other waitress had clusters of off notations beside their names, blocks of time with family. The message was arithmetic. You are not part of this. It was designed to isolate her, and the competence of it, the way he'd constructed the roster so that no one could claim coincidence, told her he understood exactly what he was doing. This wasn't anger. This was strategy. This was a man systematically dismantling something without ever raising his voice. The breaking point arrived on a Wednesday during the dinner rush. The Hernandez family occupied booth for regulars for 2 years, 3 kids under 10, parents who always ordered the same entrees. Margaret had served them 40 times. She knew their daughter took her milk warm, not cold. She knew the father was particular about his rice not touching the beans. She'd taken pride in those small accuracies, those invisible courtesies that made people feel seen. Frank materialized as she was setting down their plates. He pulled her aside near the register, speaking low but not quietly enough. "You shorted the Johnson $60 yesterday." We reviewed the register tape. The words arrived like a physical thing. Margaret felt them land. The register tape. He'd reviewed it. Had he found something, or was he fabricating evidence the way a sniper fabricates a sight picture? "I didn't," she said quietly. "Your drawer was $60 short. Their credit card receipt shows one transaction, and the cash receipt shows something different." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a register that felt like a threat disguised as confidentiality. "You're either incompetent or you're stealing from me. Either way, it ends." Behind him, the Johnsons weren't at booth for any more. They were watching. The Hernandez family was watching. 3 other tables had turned their heads. The restaurant had become a courtroom, and Frank was the judge reading the charges aloud. Margaret took one measured breath. The air moved in, moved out. She felt the pulse point in her neck, that place where a sniper looks for confirmation that the target is breathing, is alive, is human. She'd learned long ago that composure wasn't the absence of feeling. It was the decision to feel it somewhere the world couldn't see. A single tear escaped down her left cheek. She didn't wipe it immediately. She let it track for a second, acknowledgement of the thing he'd just done, and then she raised her hand and erased it with the back of her thumb. Her eyes never left his. "I've survived worse men than you," she said. The voice was completely level. No anger, no defensiveness, no crack of emotion. Just fact. Just history. Frank's face darkened. He'd expected her to crumble. He'd structured his humiliation to crack someone, and what he'd encountered instead was a wall so solid he couldn't even see the seams. His mouth opened as if to respond, but before he could, something shifted in the restaurant. At booth 7, 3 tables behind the Hernandez family, an elderly man had stopped eating. Colonel Benjamin Morrison, 72 years old, 31 years of service, commanding officer of the 75th Ranger Regiment's 3rd Battalion, had been lifting his coffee cup to his lips when he heard those words. "I've survived worse men than you." He recognized them before he recognized her face. Recognized the tone, that particular flatness that comes from having been broken down to nothing and rebuilt into something that wouldn't break again. His eyes moved across the restaurant to where a young woman stood in a server's apron, her posture perfect, her gaze locked on a manager who looked like he wanted to disappear. And then she turned to go back to her tables, and he saw her side profile. The way she moved, economical, deliberate, the movement of someone who'd learned that every gesture should have purpose. Her hand steady as she reached for a water pitcher on the station. Her shoulders squared like a soldier's shoulders. 3 tables over, Colonel Morrison set down his coffee cup. His hand trembled slightly as it touched the saucer. His breathing, which had been labored all morning, 68 years catching up with 82 military tours, suddenly felt very shallow indeed. He knew that posture. He'd commanded women who moved like that. Women who'd been through things that polite society didn't talk about at dinner parties. Women who'd learned to survive by becoming necessary and invisible in equal measure. He watched her return to the Hernandez family, watched her set down their plates with the same care she would have given to a wounded soldier, and he felt something crack open in his chest that had nothing to do with his heart condition. The restaurant continued its noise, conversation, clattering silverware, the kitchen calling out orders. Frank had retreated toward his office, his face the color of old brick. The Hernandez family had returned to their food, the moment already becoming something they'd tell their friends about but wouldn't quite be able to explain. Margaret moved through her section with the same systematic grace she'd used during her breakfast shifts, as if public humiliation was just another task to be completed before her shift ended. But Colonel Morrison, sitting in booth 7 with his coffee cooling beside him, couldn't stop watching her. He'd commanded soldiers who'd done impossible things. Soldiers who'd followed him into Tikrit when every instinct told them not to. Soldiers whose names he still carried in a memory palace he visited late at night, when the tremor in his hands got bad and he needed to remember why he'd asked them to stand up when it would have been easier to stay down. One of those soldiers had been a young major. One with steady hands and a voice that cut through chaos like a scalpel through tissue. One who'd executed an extraction that shouldn't have worked, who'd gotten 3 hostages out of a compound in the Jolin district when every military assessment had calculated it as a suicide operation. And then that major had been officially erased. Record sealed. Operation classified. He'd heard the rumors that she'd been buried in a black site, that she'd been killed in a secondary explosion, that she'd simply been disappeared the way governments disappeared people they couldn't explain to the public. He'd mourned her. He'd attended memorials that couldn't name the dead. And now she was pouring water at booth 4 in a San Diego restaurant, folding napkins with the precision of someone who'd sutured arteries under mortar fire, surviving a manager named Brennan who didn't know he was standing next to the most decorated soldier he would ever meet in his life. Colonel Morrison reached for his phone. Colonel Morrison's hand trembled around his coffee cup at booth 4. Trembled once. Then his fingers went rigid, the ceramic slipping from his grip and shattering across the tile floor with a sound like breaking teeth. His other hand clutched his chest, fingers splayed across his heart as if he could hold it inside his body through sheer force of will. His lips darkened from pink to purple to something closer to slate. The color drained from his face like someone had pulled a plug. "I can't," his voice came out fractured, the words catching on breath that wasn't there. His eyes went wide. His body pitched forward. The diner went still. That particular stillness that happens when the world forgets how to move. A fork hung suspended above a plate of eggs. A woman's coffee cup remained halfway to her lips. 2 businessmen stared at the old man's convulsing frame like he was a television they couldn't turn off. Frank burst from the kitchen, his face flushed red with something between anger and panic. "Someone call 911, he shouted, his voice carrying the tone of a man issuing commands he had no intention of following. He stood there in the threshold, hands planted on his hips, watching the scene unfold like it was happening on a screen. His eyes locked on Margaret across the restaurant floor, a look that said, "This is your problem now." She was already moving. Margaret dropped to her knees beside Morrison's collapsed form in one fluid motion, her body responding to something her conscious mind wasn't processing yet. 17 years. 17 years since Tikrit. 17 years since she'd been ordered to disappear, to erase herself, to become the kind of ghost that doesn't show up on employee databases or medical licenses. 17 years of pouring coffee, of swallowing insults from men like Frank Brennan, of keeping her hand steady while the rest of her bled out in ways no one could see. But muscle memory doesn't age. Muscle memory doesn't forget. She placed her fingers against Morrison's neck. Carotid pulse thread-like, chaotic. His respiration shallow and desperate. His skin cold despite the California heat outside. She tilted his head back, cleared his airway with two fingers that moved like they belonged to someone else, someone trained, someone who'd done this before. His breath came in wet gasps, but it came. Then she placed her hand on his chest and felt it. Tension pneumothorax. The air trapped in the space between his lung and chest wall, collapsing the lung, compressing his heart. Every breath he took made it worse. She'd seen this in the field a dozen times. Seen soldiers go from talking to blue to dead in the span of 90 seconds if you didn't decompress the chest. Pain was information. Pain was data. And his body was screaming the answer. I need a knife. Sanitized. Now, she called out, her voice dropping an octave, losing the waitress accent, becoming something harder and more precise. It wasn't a request. It was a command. What? A manager's voice from the kitchen. Confusion. Hesitation. Steak knife. The sharpest one you have. And a pen. Margaret was already working, her hands moving on their own, finding the landmarks on Morrison's chest. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The spot where a needle could release the pressure that was killing him. Her fingers marked the location with the certainty of someone who'd done this in the dark, in sandstorms, with incoming fire close enough to taste. The knife came. A server, young, terrified, pressed it into her hand along with a ballpoint pen. Margaret picked up the blade with her right hand. Muscle memory. The knife was cold and smooth, and it felt like coming home. She positioned it at the mark her fingers had found on Morrison's chest, positioned it between the second and third ribs. His eyes were barely open now, unfocused, the kind of half-conscious state that came when your brain wasn't getting enough oxygen. She pushed the knife in. The sound was subtle, a small resistance, then a give. The blade sank maybe 2 inches. Not deep. Just deep enough. Margaret twisted the knife to widen the opening, her movements economical and controlled. Her hand steady as hydraulic pressure. A hand placed itself on her shoulder, a customer, maybe, wanting to help, wanting to do something. She didn't acknowledge it. She pulled the blade out and immediately positioned the pen. The plastic tube would function as a cannula, would hold the opening in his chest wall open so the trapped air could escape. She removed the inner mechanism from the pen with one hand while still kneeling over Morrison, her movements efficient as surgery. She positioned the barrel of the pen into the wound. The hiss came immediately. A sharp whistle of air escaping from his chest, the sound of pressure releasing, of life extending itself 1 more minute. She kept her hand on the pen barrel and reached for Morrison's wrist with her other hand. His pulse was rapid but stronger now, more organized. She ran her eyes over his face. His color was returning. The purple fading to something closer to human. "Get me oxygen," she said to no one in particular. Her voice was steady. "And get an ambulance." She glanced up at the frozen restaurant. 50 people staring at her like she'd just performed an exorcism. Did someone call 911 or do I need to do that myself? "They're coming," a man said from the corner. A regular. Davis. He worked for the Port Authority. 2 minutes out. 2 minutes. 90 seconds had already passed. Morrison's oxygen saturation was climbing. She could read it in the returning color of his skin, in the way his chest was moving more easily now. "You're going to be okay," she told him quietly. Not because she was certain. Because certainty was what he needed to hear. "Stay with me." His eyes focused slightly. Found her face. Locked onto hers with the intensity of a man waking from a nightmare into a different nightmare. His lips moved. Once. Twice. Then a single word, barely a whisper, came out of his throat. Valkyrie. The room didn't go silent. The room went ****. All sound drained out of it. A word nobody in the restaurant could have understood hung in the air like a flare, like a beacon, like a call sign that hadn't been used in 17 years. Margaret's hands didn't tremble. Her expression didn't change. But something shifted in her, some wall that had been holding back an ocean finally developing a hairline crack. 2 minutes. That was how long she had. The sirens were coming. Red lights were about to turn the corner onto Harbor Drive. In 2 minutes everything would change. A man would be loaded onto a stretcher. Questions would be asked. Paperwork would begin. And somewhere in that machinery of response, someone would start asking who she was and what she knew and why an old Army Ranger colonel had called her by a name that didn't exist anymore. Morrison's hand found hers. His grip was weak but conscious. His eyes held hers and in them she saw the recognition. Complete. Absolute. He knew exactly who was kneeling over him with his blood on her scrubs and his life in her hands. The sirens grew louder. The ambulance doors slammed shut with the sound of a prison cell closing. Margaret watched the red lights bleed into the rain-soaked parking lot, her scrubs sticking to her skin, Colonel Morrison's blood already drying on her hands. The sirens faded toward Sacred Heart Medical Center 14 blocks east. She stood motionless for 17 seconds, watching the empty space where the ambulance had been, breathing the way she'd been taught to breathe, in through the nose, out through the mouth, no tremor, no shake, no tell. Frank Brennan was already on his phone. She knew this because she could see him through the diner's front window, pacing between the register and the office, his free hand gesturing like he was conducting an orchestra of his own importance. His face had the particular shade of red that came from being humiliated in front of 32 witnesses. A waitress died on the floor of his diner and his first instinct wasn't to call 911 again, it was to call someone else. Someone to fix this. Someone to make Margaret disappear the way she'd tried so hard to disappear for 15 years. The rain intensified. Margaret didn't move. Frank's voice carried through the window's cracked seal, loud enough for her to hear fragments. Health inspector. Unauthorized. Medical procedures. Endangering patrons. She'd performed that needle decompression with perfect technique, sterile knife, pen casing, all done in the exact sequence taught at Fort Bragg in 2007. The technique had saved lives in Tikrit. It had saved this man's life in 63 seconds. But to Frank Brennan, emergency medicine was liability. Blood on the linoleum was a lawsuit. A collapsed customer was a problem to be solved. Margaret pulled off her vinyl gloves and dropped them in the trash. The diner's door swung open and Diego himself emerged, his weathered face carved into an expression of pure conflict. He'd owned the diner for 23 years. He knew Margaret. Not well, she didn't allow anyone to know her well, but well enough to nod at, to ask about her nephew, to slip her an extra hash brown on Tuesday mornings when business was slow. He knew she was a good nurse because he'd seen her stop a choking customer at table 7 without being asked, performing the Heimlich with the casual competence of someone who'd done it before. Margaret. Diego's English carried the accent of Guadalajara. Frank says. I heard him. He wants you, he's saying you can't be here. He's calling the health department. He says you did something dangerous. She looked at Diego. Really looked at him. 61 years old, arthritis in his left hand, a granddaughter in college he was paying for out of pocket because his daughter got sick and the insurance company had rules about pre-existing conditions. Diego didn't need this problem. Tell him it's fine, Margaret said. I'm leaving. She walked to the employee locker room, her shoes leaving wet prints on the linoleum. The break room smelled like burnt coffee and the particular staleness of a place where people waited for their shifts to end. Her locker was the third one from the left, the magnetic nameplate reading M. Walsh in faded letters that someone had updated in 1998 and never touched again. She spun the combination lock, and it popped open with a soft click of 34-17-8. Her apron hung on a hook, weight of the pens and order pad pulling it down. Beneath it, her jacket. She'd worn the same Navy Dickies jacket for 3 years, comfortable, anonymous, made of the kind of fabric that didn't show blood or coffee stains. The left pocket had a small tear near the seam. Her fingers found the tear, worked it wider, and pulled out the faded patch. The 75th Ranger Regiment insignia, barely visible now. She'd cut it from her son Danny's first combat jacket when he deployed to Afghanistan in 2009, and she'd stitched it into her own lining that same night, 3 stitches per side, 8 years of muscle memory protecting it. She held the patch against her chest for 2 seconds, feeling the weight of it, not ounces, but years. 15 years of pretending it didn't exist. 15 years of pretending SHE didn't exist. The locker slammed. She stuffed the patch in her jacket pocket and walked out. Frank was still on the phone when she returned to the main floor, but his eyes snapped to her the moment she appeared. She watched his calculation happen in real time, the moment he decided she was a bigger threat standing there than she was going away quietly. His hand went from his ear to the office phone on the counter. He dialed without breaking eye contact. Waited. When someone picked up on the other end, his voice dropped to the tone of a man conducting important business. Yes, hello, this is Frank Brennan from Diego's Diner on Beach Street. I need to report a serious health code violation. I have an employee who performed unauthorized medical procedures on a customer today. Yeah. No medical license. She used restaurant equipment. Yeah, a knife. Yes, from our kitchen. I have witnesses. I'm concerned about, he smiled at Margaret while he spoke, a smile with no humor in it. Public safety. Margaret walked toward the back exit. She didn't rush. She didn't react. The composure wasn't hard to maintain because she'd already accepted the outcome before it happened. This was how it worked. This was why she'd never stayed anywhere longer than 3 years. This was why she'd never let anyone get close enough to ask real questions. People like Frank could smell something different about her, something that didn't fit the uniform of a waitress or a nurse, and people like Frank couldn't tolerate what they couldn't understand. The door to the parking lot closed behind her with a hydraulic whisper. The rain fell in sheets now, the kind of rain that came off the Pacific in December and washed through San Diego with the persistence of something determined. Margaret's Honda Civic was parked in the rear lot, 3rd row, the same spot she'd used for 3 years. The car was a 2004 model, painted a grey that had faded to the color of old concrete, with 267,000 miles on the odometer and a transmission that slipped whenever you accelerated above 40. She'd paid $2,800 for it in cash and never once registered it to her real name. She sat in the driver's seat and pulled the door shut. The interior smelled like stale coffee from yesterday's thermos and the vinyl seats were already cool from the rain. She pressed her forehead against the steering wheel and sat like that, perfectly still, the way soldiers sat when they were waiting for orders that wouldn't come. The engine ticked. Metal cooling. Oil settling. The car had died 6 weeks ago and she hadn't bothered to have it fixed. She'd been driving a dead machine to work every morning, coasting to a stop at red lights, pushing it into parking spaces like a corpse. She'd known, on some level she didn't examine too carefully, that she wouldn't be driving it much longer. Her hands were clean, she'd washed them in the diner bathroom, but they didn't feel clean. She could still smell the copper of Morrison's blood under her fingernails, the ghost of it, the memory encoded in skin cells she would shed and replace but never quite forget. Those hands had learned medicine in a tent hospital in Tikrit where the electricity came from a generator and the surgical kits were rationed to 1 every 6 surgeries. Those hands had closed wounds on soldiers whose names she wasn't allowed to remember. Those hands had held her son's face when he was born and she'd been granted exactly 72 hours of family leave before shipping out for her second deployment. 15 years. The rain hammered the roof of the car like 1,000 accusations. Margaret sat in the darkness, she hadn't turned on the interior lights, and felt the weight of all the decisions that had led to this exact moment. Each one had made sense at the time. Leave the military quietly, don't ask questions, don't contact anyone from the old life, don't form attachments, don't stay in one place long enough for anyone to figure out who you really were. The government had erased her service record in 2009. Major Margaret Walsh no longer existed on any official document. To the world, she was just a quiet woman who poured coffee and made minimum wage and had no distinguishing features worth remembering. But she'd saved a man's life today. And Frank Brennan had decided that was unacceptable. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out the Ranger patch. In the darkness of the car, she could barely see it, just the faintest outline of the regiment insignia, the curved shape that meant something to exactly 4,847 soldiers currently serving and maybe another 100,000 who'd served before. She held it between her fingers and thought about throwing it out the window. Just letting it fall into the rain and the asphalt and disappear the way everything else had disappeared. Her phone buzzed. A text from Diego, "He fired you. I'm sorry. Come back when you're ready." The words blurred in the darkness. She didn't cry. Soldiers don't cry. They absorb damage and integrate it into their tactical understanding. They move to the next objective. But her chest felt tight, the way it felt when she'd taken shrapnel in Helmand Province and the doc told her it was too close to critical vessels to remove without killing her, so she'd be carrying that piece of Afghanistan in her body for the rest of her life. She was carrying pieces of 15 years inside her. Pieces of Colonel Morrison's whispered call sign, Valkyrie, which meant he knew, or at least he'd started to know, which meant her cover was compromised. Pieces of her son Danny, who'd served under Morrison's command. Pieces of the classified operation in Tikrit that got buried so deep in the Pentagon's black budget that even Congress didn't know it existed. Pieces of every person she'd healed and every person she'd had to leave behind. She'd saved Morrison's life and Frank Brennan had responded the only way he knew how, with institutional power. Health inspector. Unemployment. The deliberate destruction of the one thing she'd built in San Diego, a routine, a paycheck, a place where no one asked questions. The engine ticked again. Cool metal. Dead machine. And then, somewhere above the rain, she heard it. Not a helicopter yet. Just a distant sound that didn't belong to the normal geography of San Diego at 11:19 p.m. on a Tuesday night. A sound like rotors, very far away, growing closer. The kind of sound that military people hear and understand immediately, that moves from the background of the world into the foreground of personal consequence. Margaret lifted her head from the steering wheel. The patch remained clutched in her hand, and this time she didn't throw it away. She tucked it back into the lining of her jacket, 3 stitches per side, the way she'd sewn it 8 years ago, and she waited. She didn't know what was coming. She didn't know how the system had triggered. She didn't know that Colonel Morrison had opened his eyes in the ambulance and whispered her call sign to the paramedic, or that the paramedic had written it down, or that Morrison's hospital file had been flagged by Joint Task Force Intelligence the moment his name hit the Sacred Heart admissions database. All she knew was that the sound was coming closer, and it sounded like someone had finally decided she was allowed to exist again. The local news station's 11 p.m. broadcast was live when the Pentagon official called in. 3 million viewers watching. The anchor's face went tight when the switchboard lit up, military lines only, classified protocol override. She glanced at her producer. Nodded. Put the call through. The voice that came through the speakers wasn't asking permission. It was stating fact. This is Deputy Director James Halloway, Joint Task Force Personnel Records. I'm calling regarding the segment you just aired about Margaret Walsh. Pause. Everything in that segment was false. I need your audience to understand who they're actually looking at. Frank Brennan was still in his apartment, phone pressed to his ear, listening to his brother-in-law's radio feed of the broadcast. His grip tightened on the receiver. Major Margaret Walsh, Halloway continued, served 12 years. 3 combat tours in Afghanistan and Iraq. Her service record is sealed because it is classified. What I can tell you is that she executed a hostage extraction operation in Tikrit in 2009 that saved 17 American lives and 4 coalition personnel. When that operation went sideways, she held a position against a force 3 times her size for 4 hours until extraction arrived. The anchor's hands were shaking slightly as she held her note cards. Major Walsh was ordered to disappear after that operation. The military erased her records. Buried the file. Told her she no longer existed. That order is still in effect. Until tonight, when a decorated Army Ranger colonel suffered a medical emergency at Diego's diner and Major Walsh saved his life using field medicine under pressure. You just watched someone your news director tried to destroy spend 90 seconds keeping a man alive while your management was calling for her arrest. Frank stood up. Walked to the window. His reflection stared back at him, pale and thin against the glass. She has 2 silver stars, Holloway said. Each sentence landed like a hammer strike. Bronze star with valor. 2 purple hearts. One of those came from shrapnel during the Tikrit extraction. She carried an unconscious sergeant 400 meters while bleeding out from her left shoulder. She never filed a medical report. Never took leave. Your nurse served with the kind of honor your institution doesn't deserve. The silence in the newsroom was absolute. Then the camera cut to 2 figures sitting at the edge of the broadcast set. FBI badges clipped to suit jackets. The older agent, woman with gray at her temples, leaned toward the microphone. Federal Bureau of Investigation, she said, voice steady and clinical. We've been investigating Diego's diner management for embezzlement since March. 14 months of surveillance. Frank Brennan, general manager, has stolen approximately $83,000 in cash from register deposits and altered receipts to cover the discrepancy. He needed a distraction. Margaret Walsh saw something she shouldn't have. He decided to isolate her, terminate her employment, and discredit her before she could testify. Frank's phone fell from his hand. We have video evidence, the second agent continued. 47 separate instances of theft. Security camera footage from the parking garage. Bank records. When Margaret Walsh was fired today, Mr. Brennan called our agency and attempted to file a false report claiming she violated health codes. That call was recorded. He knew we were investigating. He was trying to force us to take action against her instead of him. The camera held on Frank's chair in the newsroom studio. Empty. The anchor was reading from her teleprompter now, her voice precise and professional, but underneath it was barely contained rage at the betrayal. At the manipulation. At the network nearly destroying an innocent woman to cover a crime. Dr. Ashford, the FBI agent said, turning directly toward the camera lens, if you're watching this, you're under federal arrest for felony embezzlement, obstruction of justice, and filing a false report. Agents are en route to your residence. You have the right to remain silent. The broadcast cut to commercial. 3 million people had just watched a man's career vaporize in 8 minutes. Sacred Heart Medical Center's trauma department got the notification at 11:27 p.m. All hands. Incoming helicopter. Multi-vehicle collision on I-05. 18 minutes out. The ER team snapped into motion, trauma bays filling with controlled urgency, equipment staged, beds stripped and remade with clean linens and fresh monitors. Margaret Walsh was not supposed to be there. But the notification had gone out to all available nursing staff in the county. She'd gotten the call at 11:39 p.m. while sitting in her apartment, staring at her phone, watching the same broadcast everyone else was watching. Holloway's voice still echoing. Her name. Her rank. Her service. 13 years of erasure announced to 3 million people. She'd answered the hospital callback without thinking. Muscle memory. The need to be useful. The need to help. Yes, she'd said. I'm 10 minutes out. She pulled into Sacred Heart's parking garage at 11:49 p.m. in her dead Honda Civic that she'd push-started 3 times this month. The rotor wash from the incoming helicopter made her scrubs flutter. She moved through the corridors like she'd never left, like the past 18 hours hadn't happened, like she was still invisible and still necessary. The trauma team didn't know who she was. Not yet. They just saw a nurse moving with absolute precision, hand steady, calling out vitals before the doctors asked for them, anticipating needs 3 steps ahead. Second victim, the paramedic called out, wheeling the stretcher in. Crush injury to the left side, possible tension pneumo, O2 sat 81 and dropping. Margaret was already moving. Already had the angiocath in her hand. Already knew where the decompression needed to go. Midclavicular line. Second intercostal space. Her hands moved and found the right place between the ribs, and the needle went in, and the hiss of escaping air, and the relief was immediate and tangible. O2 climbing, the respiratory therapist called. 85. 88. 91. Dr. Ashford burst through the trauma bay doors at exactly 11:54 p.m. Scrub still on from wherever he'd been. Face electric with rage and panic. His eyes found Margaret and locked. For 3 seconds, neither of them moved. "Get her out," he said. His voice was trying to be commanding, but it cracked at the edges. "Now. You're fired. You're not permitted on this unit." Margaret didn't look up from the monitor. "Victim needs a thoracotomy. Left anterior lateral incision. Someone hand me a number for scalpel." I said, "Get out." His voice rose. Louder. The team looked up. Uncertainty rippling through the bay. This woman has no credentials here. She attacked a patient with a knife. She's a fraud. Security, remove her from my hospital. The trauma surgeon, Dr. Patterson, 40 years of experience in her eyes, stepped forward. "Dr. Ashford, we're in the middle of a resuscitation." "I don't care. I don't care. She's finished. She's done. You want your license? You help her, your license is next." Dr. Patterson's face went very still. That's when the doors to the trauma bay opened again. Not hospital security. Not paramedics. A man in dress blues. Army Ranger insignia on his collar. The rank visible, unmistakable. Colonel Morrison's aide. Behind him, 3 more officers. Then 2 men in dark suits with FBI windbreakers. Then another colonel, this one's uniform covered with ribbons that had been earned in places most people would never know about. "Dr. Ashford," the colonel said. His voice was the kind of calm that comes from having given commands in combat. "You just threatened a United States Army officer and attempted to interfere with a medical emergency. That's about to get significantly worse for you." Dr. Ashford's face went the color of old dishwater. "Major Margaret Walsh," the colonel continued, "your original discharge orders are hereby nullified. You are no longer operating under non-disclosure. You are no longer obligated to maintain silence regarding your service. And right now, you outrank everyone in this room except me. That patient needs a thoracotomy. I need you to save his life. Doctor." The way he said the last word wasn't a question. It was a direct order. Margaret looked at Dr. Ashford for exactly 1 second. Then back to her patient. "I need the scalpel. And I need him out of my way." 2 of the officers moved. Not roughly. Just firmly. Dr. Ashford found himself standing outside the trauma bay, pressed against the observation window, watching as Margaret Walsh stopped being invisible and started being a major again. Started being the person she'd always been under the uniform of a waitress. Her hands were steady as she made the incision. Left anterior lateral thoracotomy, right where it needed to be. The surgery resident was assisting, pale but focused, and Margaret's voice came back, the one the nurses who'd worked with her before the firing could swear sounded exactly like someone giving combat orders. "Retract. More. There. Clamp. I need suction. Now." 32 minutes. That's how long it took. Her patient was stable when the surgical team wheeled him toward the OR. His color was coming back. His heart was beating on its own. She'd bought him time. She stepped back from the table. Pulled off her gloves. The trauma bay was silent except for the heart monitor's steady beeping and the hiss of the ventilator. "Did I do that?" Dr. Ashford's voice came from outside the observation window. Small. Panicked. Is this because of what I said? About the health codes? I was just. The female FBI agent walked over to him. Very slowly. She pulled out a pair of handcuffs and held them where he could see them. Frank Ashford, she said, you're under arrest for felony embezzlement, filing false reports, conspiracy to commit obstruction of justice, and threat of violence against a federal officer while interfering with a medical emergency. You have the right to remain silent. I suggest you use it. The handcuffs clicked closed. 2 officers escorted him out. The nursing staff watched him pass. They watched his head drop. They watched him disappear down the corridor like a man being swallowed by something larger than himself. Margaret was already pulling off her scrubs in the locker room when the colonel appeared in the doorway. Major, he said. Colonel Benjamin Morrison asked me to tell you something. He's in recovery. He said to tell you he's finally retired, and the least you could do is retire with him. Margaret's hands paused on the locker door. She didn't turn around. He also said, the colonel continued, that any commanding officer who lets you disappear again is an idiot. Sacred Heart's administration wants to talk to you about a position. Director of Trauma. They're offering you a full retirement package and a standing order that you never take orders from anyone except your commanding officers and your own conscience. Margaret turned around. Looked at him. What do you want? The colonel asked. I want to work, she said. Just work. Trauma shifts. Difficult cases. The people everyone else gives up on. The colonel nodded like he'd expected that answer. Then that's what you'll do. Welcome home, Major. He walked out. Margaret sat on the bench in the locker room and pulled on fresh scrubs. The ones with the hospital logo. The ones with her name embroidered on the pocket. The ones that meant she could be found. In the jacket pocket, the one she'd kept from her old life, the one that had survived every move, every year undercover, she felt the weight of the patch. The faded 75th Ranger Regiment patch. The one she'd cut from Danny's first combat jacket when he deployed, before the fear had learned to hide itself. The one she'd sewn into the lining of her waitress apron with 14 careful stitches because she needed to carry him and be invisible at the same time. She held it against her chest for a moment. The fabric was soft from handling. The colors were nearly gone. But it was there. She pressed it over her heart and stood up. Dr. Ashford was gone by morning. The hospital announced a new ethics board by noon. Sacred Heart's administration offered Margaret the director position by 1 p.m. She accepted it in person, in her new scrubs, and by that evening she was training the trauma team on protocols she'd learned in places classified people pretended didn't exist. She worked 70-hour shifts. She brought cases back from the edge that other surgeons had already written off. The staff learned not to question her. The outcomes spoke for themselves. 6 months later, Dr. Frank Ashford was spotted at a strip mall in a valley suburb 40 miles east of San Diego. He was selling insurance. Low-premium policies from a folding table in front of a payday loan office. His name tag read Frank. Just Frank. No doctor anymore. No credentials. No power. The people who passed his table never knew he'd once worn a lab coat with authority. Never knew he'd destroyed himself trying to crush someone too strong to break. Sometimes Margaret would see him, if she was driving out to visit Danny, if her route took her past that particular strip mall. She never stopped. She didn't need to. She was working the evening shift at Sacred Heart when the package arrived. Official military seal. Her discharge was revoked. Her service record was unsealed. Her bank accounts received 33 years of back pay because the military had finally decided that erased officers deserved compensation, even if they'd been ordered to stay dead. She donated it all. New trauma wing. New equipment. Scholarships for nursing students. The 75th Ranger Regiment Memorial Fund. She kept working. Every shift, She pressed the patch against her chest. The one cut from her son's combat jacket. The one that reminded her why the armor underneath mattered more than the armor on top. 14 stitches holding proof that she'd never let him disappear the way the military tried to make her disappear. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. The restraint of someone who'd learned that the real combat happens in silence, in ordinary places, in the spaces between saving lives and being allowed to exist. She was a major. She was a nurse. She was a mother. She was finally, impossibly, undeniably herself. So tell me this, when the world tries to erase someone, to make them invisible, to convince them they don't matter, what does it take to fight back? Do you stay hidden and safe, or do you step into the light and risk everything? And more importantly, how many heroes are walking past you every day in scrubs, in uniforms, in regular clothes, carrying the weight of service so quietly you'd never know to look? Please, like this video. Subscribe. And leave a comment. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea who you really were?